Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today's video was suggested by one of my viewers, Money Management, who asked me to talk about how INTJs and ISTJs communicate. For those of you that are a bit unfamiliar with how the function stacks work, ISTJs and INTJs have mutual middle judging functions. So we both have extroverted thinking as a secondary and introverted feeling as a tertiary. To put it very simply, to avoid this video going on too long, it means that ISTJs and INTJs often have a mutual desire for things to be more objective and to look at what is the way of seeing the world, what is the truth that you cannot deny even if you want to. They also really value efficiency and getting things done in the most effective way possible. And then the introverted feeling is usually like they prefer being true to themselves and authentic, and they usually have a very strong belief system that like governs their decisions subtly, but because it's in the third, they're often reluctant to share that stuff, and they often present like this kind of like unemotional front, but in reality, they're actually very emotional. They just don't like to admit it or they don't like to share it very readily. I've found that the INTJs in my life are actually pretty good at sharing their emotions, but that could just be because they're Catholic and maybe like the phrase, and Jesus wept in the Gospel of John probably persuaded them to be a bit more open, or they're just interesting cases. I don't know. You guys tell me. For the ISFJs and INFJs watching, you might be glad to know that ISFJs share the dominant and bottom functions of the ISTJ, and INFJs share the top and bottom of the INTJs. So some of the stuff with regards to how our types process information and where we get confused you might be able to relate to some of that. So let me know down in the comments section how much you relate to one or both of the types and how much you're like, oh my gosh, the other type is so confusing to me. To avoid me going on and on about rambling like I did in the previous take, I think it would be best if I talk about where the mutual getting along is and then talk about where the clashing is, using a combination of real stories and just function expertise. So I think where ISTJs and INTJs really mesh is when it comes to talking about beliefs and the truth. Usually I find that INTJs are spectacular when it comes to bouncing off ideas and thoughts about how the world should be. Even if I don't completely agree with an INTJ's take on like how they think the world should be, I can at least see where they're coming from because they're using extroverted thinking. They're thinking about how things are and they're looking at things from a more objective standpoint. So it's not as though they're trying to make it the truth. They're trying to look at like statistics and graphs and charts. And so, I don't know, take for example, marriage. One of my INTJ friends, who shall remain unnamed because his thoughts are very strong on this and I don't want any of you harassing him, he firmly believes, one, that marriage should be between a man and a woman. That much we agree on. But he also thinks that the wife should primarily be a stay-at-home wife and the man should be the breadwinner so that they'll be able to effectively take care of the kids. Now, I am of the opinion that yes, that could work, but if the Catholic Church doesn't specifically have a doctrine that demands that, I don't think that should be a be-all, end-all of how things should work. I say, well, you need to think about how you're going to survive. So you need to have good money management skills. See what I did there? And you have to be able to think about what are the greatest odds of survival. So if the wife has a job or a skill set that's better at bringing in income, then she should take advantage of that skill. Just like how the Bible says, the man with many talents went out and made more talents, whereas the man who was condemned was the one who buried his talents. But at the same time, when I agree with INTJs, it's as though we're like totally on the same wavelength. Like, even when I agree with other types, it's usually like a different kind of agreeing. Like, we get to it through a different method. Like, for example, say an INFP, if we agree on something, it's usually because the INFP is strongly believing it, whereas I am like, let me give you a whole bunch of church doctrines and a whole bunch of scientific evidence about why this makes sense. Whereas with the INTJ, I can usually say, yeah, that is very objective. And they'll be quoting all these statistics, and I'll be like, uh-huh, uh-huh. And this thing is absolutely clear by matter of actual deductive reasoning. And so I find that when an INTJ and I are on the same wavelength, it leads to, frankly, some of the best discussions I've ever had. And I think that of all the activities that I do with INTJs, I feel like I like talking with them more than anything else. I think just expressing our views and thoughts on the world is just an overall very enjoyable experience, because it's very hard to find another type that is willing to really understand where I'm coming from on things as well as they do. Where the clash comes in is with the dominant and inferior functions, because INTJs, with their introverted intuition, they're very futuristic people. They like to think ahead about their futures. Now, that's not to say ISTJs don't. IJs in general have a preference towards wanting to know how something is going to turn out as opposed to being surprised. They like to know ahead of time what the plan is and what the agenda is. Usually they're a little bit more easygoing than the EJs, but they still don't like being in an atmosphere of total chaos. But ISTJs like to think about the immediate foreseeable future, whereas INTJs, they think so far ahead that they're often into this like realm of the complete unknown, at least from my perspective. I remember my best friend, he would often be talking about his plans for his wedding before he even had a girlfriend. And I'd be like, whoa, 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 slow down. How can you be already planning your wedding that quickly? But it was because he was so determined to find a girlfriend and get a wife and settle down that he was already thinking about it as though he was already engaged. So he was thinking that many steps ahead. That's not to say I don't do that, but it's typically like kind of flickers, like a flashlight that's about to run out of batteries for me. Like, I might think, okay, I might not want to wear a suit at my wedding and I might want it to be quiet, but it's like very, very little itty bitty details. Usually when I try to think about the future, it's very foggy. Like, there's this, I'm trying to describe what's in my brain at the moment. It's like this not black, brown, ugly cloud. And then there's like tiny little glimpses of the future in there. But they're usually very minute and lacking a lot of detail. Like, I might say, oh, in April, I'm going to Kalahari. But I might like only picture, say, a snippet of the water park instead of trying to imagine the whole environment. Or I might say, in May, this game is coming out, but I'm only able to get little snippets of the game because I haven't watched much of the trailers. I don't like to engage in a lot of speculation and what ifs, which is where the INTJ and I sometimes clash, because sometimes my best friend will try to like interpret the hidden meaning behind things, and he really likes speculative books such as Dante's Inferno, and I'm like, you lost me after the first paragraph. And I think both types not using extroverted feeling, they're not particularly great at tiptoeing around each other. Like, my best friend, he does not notice for the life of him when I am bored out of my mind of his theoretical and philosophical talk. I literally have to say, stop! I am annoyed right now. But even then, sometimes he still doesn't get it, because you have to be kind of explicit when it comes to your feelings with INTJs, or they're not going to pick up on it. I usually have to say, like, you are boring the heck out of me. Shut up. And I know that sounds mean to some of you, but because their extroverted feeling is in the seventh, you have to be that forceful, or they're just going to think, oh, okay, I'll continue. Again, that could be inattentive ADHD talking, but in general, INTJs don't stop to ask people if they're bored or not because they don't use sensing. They don't look at sensory clues of like a person's body language or something like that. Admittedly, I'm not that great at it either, but I at least notice when people are acting different than what I'm used to. So I might say, you're quieter than usual. What could that mean? And so that usually leads to me asking people if they're okay, even if they are okay. Whereas INTJs don't really do that a whole lot. Another thing that INTJs do that causes a bit of a clash is that they like to constantly keep things evolving. They don't like to settle for too much of a routine. They like routine to a certain extent, but nowhere near as much as I do. When my best friend and I used to take walks in my old neighborhood, I would always take the same route to the park. Most of the time he didn't care because he would forget that it was the same route and he'd just go on and on about whatever he was feeling, and like he'd be like, "Oh, yeah, we did take the same route. What the heck?" But every now and then he'd be like, "Oh, do we have to do the same thing? This is getting boring." Another thing that's interesting about INTJs is their lack of awareness of what's going on around them. It's absolutely staggering how many times I'm like, "Didn't you notice that? What the heck? Are you blind or something?" when I'm around them. Just to name a few examples of INTJ blunders that I've experienced: going the wrong way on the road, not seeing a stop sign, forgetting the rules of the road, and driving in this very haphazard way that's constantly getting honked at, leaving their car doors wide open so that anyone could get into the car and not thinking that maybe that's a bad thing to do. Again, I could go on and on, but INTJs just are probably one of the least observant personality types I've ever seen. They're typically very forgetful as well. Admittedly, most INTJs aren't as bad as my best friend because, again, he has inattentive ADHD, but they're still not the greatest at remembering details. Like, I have an INTJ female friend who's pretty similar to my best friend, but because she doesn't have ADHD, she is at least a little bit better at noticing some things. But if I ask her to do something, she always asks me to remind her because otherwise she completely forgets. And I also think she's a little bit, ever so slightly better at detecting people's feelings, but it's still like this much of a sensitivity because she is Catholic like me. And so obviously as Catholics, we're asked to love one another and like respect one another as Jesus respected us. So I think Catholic INTJs have a bit more of a friendly vibe to them. Most INTJs that aren't Catholic have a little bit of this closed off, like, "Oh, hey, what do you need?" kind of thing. Like, not exactly emotionless, but very even keel. And they don't seem to express a whole lot of extreme emotions. When they talk about their emotions, it's very extreme, but you often have to get them to trust you to get them to that point. My INTJ female friend, she'll sometimes put like ha-has and the occasional smiley face in our messages, but usually she like just types out whatever it is she's thinking. It's not a whole lot of touchy-feely language, but in streams, she can be quite animated. Admittedly, she doesn't stream very much, but when she did, she would like, on the few times she did use a webcam, she would smile when people came into the chat and she'd be like, "Hello, welcome to the stream." But it would be like the bare minimum of excitement. It wouldn't be this, "Oh my gosh, hi," like some of the feeling types would do. It would be this very calm and collected, "Hey, great to see you. Glad you can make it." One thing that I think doesn't get talked about enough about INTJs is their sense of humor. It is very different from mine, though, because I think for them, their humor is coming from their introverted intuition. I don't really know how to explain it, but usually like they have very whimsical types of things that they like to say on a whim. Whereas for me, my humor tends to be a bit more over the top and dad-ish because I'm using introverted sensing to look at things in a very literal manner, whereas their humor is a bit more of it's not exactly literal. It's really hard to explain, but let's just say that because I use extroverted intuition, even though it's at the bottom, I still use it more than they do. So it leads to like me having these wild and wacky sayings that catch them off guard every single time. Like for example, with my INTJ female friend, sometimes she'll have these long hiatuses, hiati, whatever the word is, where she like won't talk to anyone for a while. And so when she finally returns, I'll be like, "You've returned from the depths of the underworld. What was it like shaking hands with Hades? Or am I speaking to an alternate version of you that's willing to be social?" And she's like, "Ha ha 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 ha. Hi, Paul. Good to see you again." Like, you can clearly tell that she was not expecting that whatsoever, and she's trying to catch up and like, what was he trying to say there? Thankfully, because that's my inferior function, that's typically more of on a when needed basis. And most of the time, I'm pretty straightforward with when I'm talking. I think in terms of how INTJs communicate, they're a little bit better than INFJs, at least for me personally, because again, using extroverted thinking, they think about like what's objective. So they don't often try to disguise or sugarcoat their words as much. They're typically a bit more of this is what it is and this is what I'm going to say, which I kind of am like that too. And so it leads to me very rarely, if ever, misunderstanding what they are saying. I might not necessarily understand their perspective. I might not necessarily be able to keep up with all their futuristic talk. But at least with INTJs, it's typically pretty easy to understand, again, what they're trying to say. If they're trying to communicate that they're upset with me, I can usually tell. If they're trying to clarify something, I usually don't need to ask, like, what do you mean by that? I can typically be like, okay, I get it. And they're typically the same with me, possibly even better because they use intuition so they can fill in the blanks. I don't actually think there are too many INTJs that ask for clarification on what I have to say because they're just so good at recognizing the judging functions at play. But I do think that where the INTJ excels over the INFJ is that they're much more honest. They're much more willing to just say things as they are when they come up. Now, this could just be because my INTJ friends are Catholic, and so again, they have more of that emphasis on loving one another and the "and Jesus wept" verse in the Bible that encourages that, even the Son of God was crying, so crying is not a mortal sin. But INTJs, when they feel something and when something is bothering them, they typically don't wait to say it. INFJs, when something is bothering them, they often have to process, like, why am I feeling so bizarrely? What is going on with me that is causing me to have this negative feeling? And then they say, oh, it's because of what Paul said. Now I have to figure out how to say it in such a way that won't hurt Paul's feelings. And then I also have to muster up the courage to be able to be confrontational. And it's this very long and involved process. And by the time they finally get around to saying it, I'm like, why didn't you just say it? INTJs don't have that problem. My INTJ female friend is often very clear when I said something that was out of line or that bugged her. She'll often just say, like, I didn't appreciate what you said, in like this very blunt, matter-of-fact way. A lot of times she has to apologize later for being a bit forceful, because then I explain, like, oh, it was a simple misunderstanding, or I wasn't understanding what you were saying. And she's like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. But at least they're being honest. They're not trying to sugarcoat their feelings. They're just expressing it as it is. Admittedly, they're not the most touchy-feely types but they are willing to share what's on their mind with ease. And I think that leads to us usually being able to know how to get along with each other relatively well because they typically express their boundaries right away. Definitely something most INFJs don't do because I think INFJs expect most people to think like them, so they expect that everyone is going to have those giant intuitive leaps in logic, whereas INTJs using introverted feeling are very much in the mindset of these are my feelings and my emotions and they are mine, and they don't expect everyone else to have that mindset because it's introverted feeling. So that's why they don't often like have this expectation to conform everyone to their will, at least when it comes to their emotions. They do have this like very strong worldview of how they think things should be, which is how I think too. And more often than not, I think we have a lot of agreement there. I forget whether I said this in a previous take or not because they're all blending together at this point, but usually when an INTJ is like in agreement with me on something, we come to the same pattern of how we agree on it. Like for example, my INTJ friends are all Catholic. So whenever they have a strong view on how things should be, they'll often like quote the catechism or the Bible as a means of justification. They'll say, this is what Vatican II said, therefore it is. And I'll often say, yeah, I totally agree. Or if their feelings in the moment are particularly telling them that they're feeling a certain way, I'll be like, well, don't you forget that the catechism said that? They'll be like, oh yeah, that's true. Admittedly, it's very hard for either type to 100% rely on objective logic because I think tertiary introverted feeling, even because it's not in the inferior, it leads to them using their emotions more than you would think. They might not display it a whole lot. They might not like show it on their face what they're feeling, but they definitely factor in their emotions into way more factors than you would think. So even though they try to say that it's all based on charts and graphs and church doctrines, at some point they're going to slip up and say, yeah, this is totally my opinion. This is totally how I feel about it. And this is totally me talking. So a lot of times, because it's so individual, we'll often talk out how we both feel. And then we'll try to like relate it to some kind of scientific or objective principle to come to an understanding. And most INTJs, even if they're not Catholic, they tend to come to a mutual respect of how I talk. Like even the non-Catholic INTJs are like, you know what, Paul? You're actually a pretty smart guy, and I respect you for that. They're not going to be touchy-feely about it, but they're at least going to express that in the moment they're feeling understood. So this video is going on a bit too long, so I think I'll stop here. Hopefully I gave enough examples. Money management, if I wasn't sufficient in making this video, let me know in the comments what more I should have said or if you have more questions, and I'll try to answer them in comment form. Special thanks to my patrons, Sploon Ghost Splatcat, Matthew Rakowski, and Scooter Doodle for supporting me on Patreon. You know the drill about the link in the description. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!